Hey everyone, I'm HarvestBuildDestroy, and in this video I'm going to talk about Iron Harvest, a 2020 RTS game from King Art Games. Although it's their first RTS, King Art Games is an established studio, perhaps best known for the point-and-click adventure series The Book of Unwritten Tales. Iron Harvest is basically a Company of Heroes meets Dawn of War 2 type game with a steampunk setting. In the alternate historical version of 1920 it depicts, the dominant vehicle is the mech. Iron Harvest doesn't bring anything completely new to the table, but it does combine gameplay elements in a unique enough way that, at least to me, it feels like a distinct game in the Relic-style subgenre of RTS as opposed to being a straight-up clone. But it is teetering on the threshold, and I wouldn't necessarily blame someone for calling it a clone. It is at all times extremely obvious where Iron Harvest is getting its inspiration from. As for whether or not you should play it, I think for the most part it's a well-made RTS game, especially considering it was made by a first-time RTS developer, but there are some things that could make it a bit of a tough sell. It's a decidedly pricey game, and although they've been adding to it since release, it launched with a couple of missing features. Features that some of its financial backers expected it to launch with. The core game is solid, but the package is definitely lacking in game modes and maps. Personally, I've enjoyed playing the game and find it to be an interesting enough take on the Relic RTS formula, but I ultimately find it to be outclassed by the games it was inspired by. But let's start with how it works. Like in Company of Heroes or Dawn of War, you acquire resources in Iron Harvest by capturing and holding points on the map. The game features a pretty standard 2-resource economy with a primary and a tech resource, in this case iron and oil. Everything costs iron, but the higher you go up the tech tree, the more oil things tend to cost. In Iron Harvest, your rates of iron and oil income are entirely separate. You increase your iron income by capturing iron points, and you increase your oil income by capturing oil points. You can also individually upgrade any iron or oil point by spending resources, but the upgrade is permanent, so if you lose it, your opponent will receive the increased income from the upgraded point. Upgrading an iron point costs a little bit of iron and a decent chunk of oil, while upgrading an oil point costs a little bit of oil and a decent chunk of iron, so upgrading points can be used to balance out your economy a bit. As you might expect, there are also 3 victory points on each map. The game's win condition is identical to Company of Heroes. You start with a victory counter of 500, and if your opponent controls more victory points than you do, your counter will drain. The first player or team to get to 0 loses. There are also finite resource stockpiles scattered around the maps that can be gathered by infantry squads, as well as infantry weapon drops. The way picking up weapons works is a bit different from Company of Heroes, where picking up a heavy weapon will split your squad in 2. In Iron Harvest, when infantry squads pick up weapons, they completely change classes and drop their previous weapons, which other infantry units, both friend and foe, can then pick up. The same goes for any infantry squad that dies. As well as just heavy weapons like machine guns, grenades, and so on, basic infantry squads and engineer squads can also drop their kits when they die or change class, so you can always change back in Iron Harvest if you want to. One important thing to note here is that when you pick up the basic infantry kit of a downed enemy squad, your squad won't turn into your opponent's faction's basic infantry unless it's a mirror matchup. Instead, you get your own faction's basic infantry squad. The game features 3 factions which are around 2/3 asymmetrical. Polania, Rusviet, and Saxony. That is, Poland, Russia, and Germany. Polania's basic infantry are armed with rifles, Rusviet's with shotguns, and Saxony's with submachine guns. Most of each faction's other infantry units are shared and identical in terms of combat effectiveness. They look different for each faction, but that's purely cosmetic. One exception to this is your Grenadier unit, which is just your basic infantry kit with an added grenade ability. Each faction can build anti-mech gunner infantry, as well as heavy MG squads, mortars, and anti-mech field cannons, but there is one unique infantry kit for each faction. Polania can build light MGs, Rusviet can build flamethrowers, and Saxony can build medics. However, if you kill another faction's unique infantry, you can still pick up the kit. You just can't create the other faction's unique infantry from your own base. Lastly, there's also a special heavy infantry unit for each faction that doesn't drop its kit on death. Like in Relic games, all of your units gain experience in combat and can be promoted to veteran and elite, increasing their stats. Some units also have castable abilities that only unlock upon reaching veteran status. The game's tech trees are extremely simple. Aside from your headquarters building, you just have a barracks for infantry units and heavy weapons, and a workshop for mechs. Each faction can build 6 different mechs, all of which are entirely unique to that faction. Both barracks and workshops have 2 tiers of units, and need to be manually upgraded to unlock the higher tier. And that's your entire tech tree, aside from field defenses. There are no global upgrades and no global abilities. You don't need to build a barracks first to unlock the ability to build a workshop either, though you almost always will in a skirmish game for 2 reasons. The first is that you won't have enough oil to build a workshop for quite a while in a normal skirmish game, and the second is that building either structure unlocks the most unique mechanic Iron Harvest has to offer, the reserve system. The reserve system is sort of Iron Harvest's equivalent of / replacement for the Company of Heroes commander system, but it's definitely its own thing. Before a skirmish game starts, in addition to choosing your faction, you're given 6 coins to spend on reserve units. The first of those units must be one of your faction's 3 heroes. Your heroes are, as you might expect, powerful units with castable abilities. When they die, they remain on the ground and must be revived by a friendly unit, so be careful how far forward you go with your hero. In addition to your hero, which costs between 1 and 3 of your 6 reserve coins, you can also choose from a variety of other units. Your reserves are divided into Reserve 1 and 2, and are basically one-time deployments of whatever units you select, free of their normal tech requirements, but deploying them also increases your unit cap. Your Reserve 1 requires a barracks or workshop to deploy, and will spawn your hero and up to 2 other units at your headquarters building, depending on how you spend your coins. Your Reserve 1 units may consist of units that are normally locked behind a workshop or an upgraded barracks, and may even include the other faction's unique infantry units that you can't otherwise build yourself. Since it only requires a barracks to send, it is often extremely cost-effective, and in my experience, most players seem to spend at least 4 or 5 of their 6 coins on Reserve 1. While you get much stronger units per coin spent on Reserve 2, deploying Reserve 2 requires you to have built both a barracks and a workshop, and to have upgraded one of them. In theory, you can spend all of your coins aside from your mandatory hero on scary Reserve 2 units for a late-game death push, but you might have trouble surviving the early game if you do, since most players seem to go for a strong Reserve 1 spike. The reserve system seems interesting to me, but I imagine they might have some issues balancing it. At least on paper, it gives you some leeway to adapt your faction to the map and matchup, but since you have to blind pick your reserves at the beginning of the game, I could imagine some unfortunate coin flippy sort of blind counter scenarios occurring in individual matches, especially 1v1s. For instance, if you both go for strong Reserve 1 spikes and your opponent happens to hard counter yours, it might be a rough game. Still, I do like how this system seems to add a lot of variety without bombarding you with novel information, since the reserve units are all normal tech tree units you can build anyway. My biggest gripe with Company of Heroes 2 was that there were so many different commanders in the game with unique units and abilities that it exponentially increased the amount of content you had to be familiar with to truly feel like you understood the game. The reserve system seems like an interesting way to inject a somewhat comparable amount of variety without the same requirement for encyclopedic game knowledge. In theory, anyway. It all depends on how well they can balance the system so that different strategies are viable enough that players won't all pick the exact same reserves every game. In my relatively limited experience playing Iron Harvest multiplayer, it has seemed to me that the game isn't exactly devoid of balance problems. However, most of the multiplayer I played was in the first couple of weeks after launch, and there have been balance updates since. Long story short, I had intended to make this video rather sooner than this, but my old laptop died a few weeks ago and my usual method of writing video scripts and recording audio was disrupted for a while. So take this with a grain of salt, but at least when I was playing multiplayer, almost literally everyone played Saxony with the same hero. I won't claim to be an expert on the game's balance, but Saxony's basic submachine gun infantry seemed to me to be quite a bit stronger than the other faction's infantry. It also seemed to me that everyone I encountered using matchmaking already knew what they were doing. I got the impression that they were mostly, if not entirely, Kickstarter supporters who'd been in the betas for a long time. Although I never encountered it myself, I also saw people online complaining about the Polanian cavalry hero, who apparently was quite good at rushing bases and killing buildings at launch. I mentioned before that Iron Harvest was a bit lacking in features. There's a decent amount of campaign content, but aside from that, there just isn't much here. Although they've added a few more since launch, there were originally only something like 6 or 7 skirmish maps. At the time that I'm writing this, there are 10 in total. 4 2-player maps, 3 4-player maps, and 3 6-player maps. The devs have said that they intend to make a map editor eventually, but for now, the stock maps are all you get. If you want to play 1v1 ladder, you'll be playing the same 4 maps over and over. If you want to play 2v2s or 3v3s, you'll be playing the same 3 maps over and over. Iron Harvest currently only has maps for up to 6 players, so 4v4s are not even possible yet. The question of 8-player maps has been raised before, but the only official information I could find about them was this Q&A response from the devs in late 2019 before the beta. Quote, "We have a 6-player map and an experimental 8-player map in development. The 6-player map will probably be part of the beta. Whether or not we're going to release the 8-player map depends on our internal testing. It is very demanding when it comes to memory, so it might not work out in the end." End quote. Based on this, it seems unlikely that we'll see 8-player maps in Iron Harvest, but I really do hope they'll continue adding maps and come out with the promised map editor. The currently limited map pool not only limits replay value, but will probably also make it harder for new players to get into the multiplayer over time, because regulars will be so intimately familiar with the maps that new players will have an even harder time competing than they otherwise would. Aside from the campaigns and 10 skirmish maps, all you get are 3 single-player challenge missions. They're worth trying, but there isn't much to say about them. They're basically survival mode where waves of enemies come at you and you try not to die. As for the campaigns, they are at least decently lengthy. There are 3 7-mission campaigns, 1 for each faction, which you have to play in order. The missions themselves are fairly long and usually multifaceted, where the map may expand out into a new area once you complete an objective. They remind me a bit of the campaigns from Ancestors Legacy. While the mission design itself is fairly modern, with a few exceptions, you're almost entirely using units and heroes from the normal tech tree, so playing through the campaigns will actually prepare you for multiplayer, at least in the sense of making you familiar with all of the game's content. This actually led to me playing a decent amount of the campaigns, despite being more of a multiplayer-only kind of guy who tends to view campaigns as at best a brief aperitif. Normally, when I see a world map or non-tech tree units and upgrades in a campaign, I lose interest and move on to skirmish, but since that wasn't the case here, I ended up finishing the first campaign and getting a couple of missions into the second one, despite not being terribly impressed with the story. As I mentioned in my first look video on Iron Harvest, the story is pretty hokey. However, there is something you can do to minimize that a bit. Under game and UI settings, you have options for text language and spoken language. The text language is for subtitles, and the spoken language is what you hear. I recommend that you try changing the spoken language to native, which will make the Polonian characters speak Polish, the Rusviet characters speak Russian, and the Saxonian characters speak German. Although it's a bit weird to hear a character respond in German after being spoken to in Polish, it's better than the alternative. The character's use of English slang is more than a little tone deaf, and if you leave the English voiceover on, it's about as corny as it gets. The script is the same regardless, and maybe it's just me, but I at least find the dialogue somewhat more palatable in pure subtitle form. However, mid-mission, this can also cause some difficulties, if like me you don't speak Polish, German, or Russian. I occasionally found myself missing objectives and hints and so on because I mistook instructions for normal unit responses since they were in languages I don't speak. The subtitles were still there, of course, but mid-game I would occasionally not notice. Eventually, I ended up using native spoken language for the cutscenes and English in-game, and this is what I would recommend. On that note, there are quite a few cutscenes, around one per mission, and they're pretty well done aside from dialogue gripes. The campaigns do feature co-op mode as well, but it might not be what you expect. Iron Harvest's co-op mode is basically Archon mode from StarCraft 2. That is, you and a friend collectively control the same set of units and structures you would control if you were playing single player. I think people were expecting a proper two-player version of the campaign with separate bases and units. On top of that, the game also didn't launch with co-op, which rightly upset some of the game's Kickstarter supporters. In general, Iron Harvest does come across as a bit of an undercooked product that probably could have used a few more months of development. Personally, I went into it pretty much blind, so I didn't have the same expectations as players who'd been following it for longer, but not all of the game's backers seem to be satisfied with the end product. And I think they have a point. It's a pretty bare-bones package for such a steep price tag. I paid just under 70 Canadian for it, and if I didn't have a YouTube channel, I doubt I would have bought it on day one. And yet I'm probably easier to please than most on this front. As long as a game has functional competitive multiplayer and an acceptably sized player base, that's all I'm really looking for. My personal gripes with Iron Harvest are more related to its basic formula than a lack of promised features. With the exception of the reserve system, which I think at least has potential, I don't care for most of the ways Iron Harvest differs from the Company of Heroes formula. I'm a big fan of Company of Heroes' munition resource, and I find myself missing it here. If you've never played Company of Heroes, munitions is a resource used to upgrade individual squads or vehicles with special weapons, make use of castable unit abilities like grenades, and global abilities like airstrikes. I really like how the munitions resource draws a sharp line between the decisions you make regarding how many and which units to put into the field, and how to best make use of those units. In Iron Harvest, your unit's abilities just have cooldowns instead, and there are no global abilities at all. Given that this style of RTS already leaves you with quite a bit less to do than more traditional RTS games with worker units and more elaborate base building, I'm not a huge fan of the decision not to include global abilities too. The game feels a bit more like Dawn of War 1 and less like Company of Heroes and Dawn of War 2 in this regard. There are fewer tasks for you to perform in general, and the combat system is quite a bit simpler. I suspect that Iron Harvest will end up with a lower skill ceiling than its forebears. In general, the infantry combat just doesn't seem as deep. I think one of the reasons is that there's only one level of cover, while Company of Heroes has light cover, heavy cover, and even negative cover when you're on a main road. This compounds with the fact that Iron Harvest doesn't make use of RNG in the way Company of Heroes does, and I never thought I'd say this, but I think that's to its detriment. In Company of Heroes, units have variable accuracy based on their range from the target in question, and in conjunction with the multi-level cover system, this means there's a lot you can do to manipulate the RNG in your favor. Based on the interaction between your level of cover, your opponent's level of cover, and the effective ranges of your respective weapons, you have to constantly reposition your squads mid-fight to come out ahead. In Iron Harvest, where your squad's health just drains at a steady rate, it just doesn't feel like there's much for you to do. Sure, it's annoying when your opponent gets a lucky hit that kills a vehicle in Company of Heroes, but the way the combat in these types of games functions relies on this kind of RNG. Without it, the combat feels a bit flat, or at least it does to me. Another little gripe I have with the infantry combat is that the grenade ability's animation is pretty slow and obvious, and in multiplayer, it's almost impossible to land on someone who's actually paying attention. It's the opposite in single player too, where the AI never even tries to dodge them. Successful grenades give a lot of experience too, so in single player, you can abuse this by having your squads temporarily pick up grenades just to get veterancy and then switch kits to something else. Another thing I was a bit disappointed by in Iron Harvest was the base building, although this might just be me. Two things that jumped out at me right away as I was initially exploring Iron Harvest were how fragile production buildings were and how they didn't have any kind of attack. At least in theory, it seemed that full frontal base assaults might be plausible in Iron Harvest, unlike in Company of Heroes where bases are generally impregnable until you're really far ahead and about to win on points anyway. I had high hopes for this, as I consider attacking and defending bases to be the most interesting and exciting parts of playing RTS games. Fighting over empty space in the middle of the map in Relic-style games has never hit the spot in the same way. But unfortunately, attacking bases doesn't seem to come into play quite as much as I would have hoped in Iron Harvest, particularly because most of the mechs are actually even slower than infantry. There are also capturable anti-mech guns on the map that you can pick up quickly and easily if your opponent comes out with a threatening mech early on. Depending on how future maps and balance updates go, full frontal base assaults are at least conceptually possible, but I suppose whether or not they'd actually be interesting as opposed to abusive remains to be seen. The previously mentioned Polonian cavalry base rush tactic didn't sound particularly interesting to me, but maybe some more interesting aggressive strategies will be possible down the line as the game receives additional updates and players develop its meta. But for now, the base building seems to be mostly cosmetic. Another thing I think is worth mentioning here is the lack of an upkeep mechanic in Iron Harvest. In Company of Heroes, your rate of income for the primary resource is reduced based on your current supply score, which keeps you and your opponent's unit counts relatively similar. Iron Harvest doesn't work like this. If you capture more points than your opponent, you get more resources and can hypothetically field a much larger army. I don't really have a strong opinion on this either way, and I'll leave it up to you to decide whether this is a good or bad thing, but Iron Harvest seems to be more of a game where you can outmuscle your opponent with a larger army after gaining an early advantage. It seems to me that there's less comeback potential in Iron Harvest for better or for worse. In my experience, the average 1v1 match is quite a bit shorter than in Company of Heroes 2. It feels to me more like a game where you can sometimes get to a big-ass late-game army that just sorta A-clicks across the map to victory. Well, figuratively A-click to victory anyway, since WAS and D are used to move the camera. And that's just about all I have to say about Iron Harvest. Despite its flaws, it's a pretty well-made game and a solid first showing from King Art Games, at least in terms of its core gameplay. I really hope that the game will be able to sustain a multiplayer community in the longer term, as the major developers in the genre could certainly use some more competition. I'm glad to see smaller devs are starting to imitate and innovate Relic-style games, rather than just churning out CNC, Blizzard, and AoE clones that don't quite capture what made those games work in the first place. That's all for this one, though. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, remember to rate, comment, subscribe, share, hit the bell, and all that. See you soon.